Our next speaker is Sami DiPasquale. I practiced that. Did I say it again? DiPasquale?
Oh, yeah.
All right, is that good? All right, good. Should we have everyone say? No. Okay. Sami lives in an immigrant community on the U.S.-Mexico border in El Paso, Texas. He has lived among immigrant communities much of his life. He grew up overseas, spending most of his childhood in the Middle East. He has lived in Jordan, Cyprus, Egypt, and India. And he currently is the executive director of Ciudad, Nueva, in El Paso. It's community outreach in El Paso, Texas. And he is also on the national board of the Christian Community Development Association. So he's a big wig. We are happy to have him speak and share it with us. And welcome him, please.
Sure. Thank you. It's great to be here. If we can get this PowerPoint going, great. There's a bunch of pictures. And then you'll be looking at that instead of me, so that's better. But if not, that's okay too. So I've lived in a whole bunch of deserts. We've heard some of those places. In Jordan, it's right next to Israel, sandwiched between Israel, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, or Syria, and then Lebanon. And it looks very similar to the Southwest, which I'm grateful for, because that's where I live now, and down in El Paso. So when I first arrived in El Paso, I was excited. I was like, wow, that looks like home. And so in Jordan, there's certain deserts. I was there from when I was born until I was about 12. And then I lived in Cyprus, a little island in the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, for most of high school. It's pretty arid as well, arid Mediterranean, with the added beauty of having beaches as well. So that was nice. You got the desert and the beach, which is good. And then my parents still live in the Middle East. They have for about 40 years. And they've been sort of in Jordan, Cyprus, Egypt, Sudan, Iraq, Sudan, back to Jordan now. And while they were in Egypt, I was in and out of Egypt a lot, all through my 20s, and I spent a year there studying. And looks like we might get this, so there might be some of those pictures. But I guess but most of the places where I lived, it was also in the big cities. So it's in the desert, it's in an arid region. And but it's also in big cities, so it's in an urban environment. And I found myself, as you were talking, I was thinking the same thing. That's exactly where I find God. I find God in the middle of highly urban areas, and also in the wilderness, whether the wilderness is sort of wild deserts or something else. Yeah, this is great. Thank you. So that's Jordan. This is Cyprus, sort of looks like that. Looks a little similar to here, where the mountains sort of like, it was also in Cloudcroft near here, right? Arid by the beach, really nice. All right, this is Mount Sinai in Egypt. That's my wife when we were dating. I love this place. When I think about wild places, this is exactly where the Ten Commandments were received. I know. But this is historically Mount Sinai. It is rough, crazy territory. I mean, there's hardly a brush there, you can see. But I've spent a night up on Mount Sinai, just crazy wind, cold, wrapped up, and I mean, away from everything that I know. You know, everything that you know, and you experience God there, or I experienced God there. I spent a year in India, and right after that, I wandered around a fair amount as I did in my late teens, early 20s, and I was living in India for a year, and I was mainly in the mountains in the Himalayas, which was not desert at all, but I had to go to the desert and go on a camel trek for a few days at least, just because I was drawn, right? Desert. That's the Grand Canyon with my wife. Ended up in El Paso. This is in El Paso, Franklin Mountains, right down the middle of the city. And then this is my family, just to get it right, 4 kids. This was last week. We were at the Copper Canyon in southern Chihuahua. It's about 8 hours south of El Paso, but I have 3 daughters, 1 son. I don't know if you can see that. And they've all grown up in El Paso. And so here, but these are the cities that were in those deserts, right? This is Amman in Jordan, Nicosia in Cyprus, this is Cairo, Egypt, this is El Paso. And so I guess when I was thinking about lessons from the desert, I was again drawn like, what is this mix of wilderness and beauty, sort of wild in the desert, alone? I think of like cold nights, windy, and of course in the day sometimes blaring heat. But then in the middle of cities too, and I think it's just that I'm drawn to sort of the wildness, the chaos of inner cities, but then the wildness and maybe almost like chaotic like wilderness environment, if you want to say it like that, of a desert. I actually, probably when I was about 19, I was pretty far from God. I was pretty disillusioned with the church. My parents worked with the church growing up, so I grew up in the church, in a very Christian environment. But I was in college, and I left, and I thought what I needed to do was go to a monastery in the middle of the desert. I thought I needed to get away, and that's where I would encounter God. And I was really sad when I felt beyond a shadow of a doubt that I needed to go, and ended up studying in Cairo, which I think was a great thing, but that's not what I thought I needed. I thought what I needed to encounter God was to go physically to the desert and to a monastery. I didn't really have intentions of being a monk for the rest of my life, but I wanted to go study and learn and see what I could see there. Well, this last fall, I was with a group of people trying to, visiting churches in the Middle East to see what we could learn from what is the active living church in the Middle East doing. We were in Egypt and Jordan and in Israel in the West Bank. And this right here is Bishop Thomas of the Coptic Egyptian Church. And the Coptic Church is a 2,000-year-old church, probably many of you know this, that was started in the 1st century. And that's actually where sort of the desert fathers and mothers are from. And the whole idea of sort of desert theology sort of comes out of that. And Bishop Thomas explained to us, it was just unbelievably beautiful. This is 2,000 years later of this active church in Egypt. He explained how from when Mark first came to Egypt until the 3rd century, Christians were under persecution. And then, of course, it became part of the Roman Empire around that time. And then all of a sudden, you weren't going to be persecuted for being a Christian anymore. And what ended up happening is some of the leaders in the church, in particular sort of called the Father St. Anthony of the Desert, he was like, it's getting co-opted by empire. It's convoluted. Before we knew what we were Christians, we were following Jesus, we knew how to do that, and we may die for it, but we knew how to live. But then, once all of a sudden we're not fighting for our lives, and we're not fighting for survival, and it's not sort of at its purest form, it's getting so convoluted with culture and mixed in with the power structures that we don't even know what reality is, what really following Jesus is. And so we had to go to the desert to learn. And so we still go to the desert to learn. And so they still have Coptic monasteries scattered all around Egypt. And beautiful places, and they're welcoming, and many people go visit them. And you could stay there often and engage in sort of the rhythms of life for a while. But I just thought that was just an unbelievable thing to me to hear that coming from someone from the most ancient church, because I hear that in sort of Christian community development circles, sort of right now, in the U.S. Like, what do we do when we're so mixed in with empire or with just the power structures that we just don't know how to act? So how do we function as followers of Jesus when our faith is co-opted by empire? Which I think right now in the U.S. is a really good example, where it's intertwined, right? Are we a Christian nation? Are we not? Do we have Christian roots? Do we not? What are those Christian roots? How do we separate them? All these questions. So what do? We enter the desert. We enter the desert to try to figure out what is our faith? What does it really mean to follow Jesus? And the desert provides ways of preventing the world from shaping us into its image. And so as I was thinking about the desert, because, like I said, I had longings to enter the desert and thought that's where I was going to really find how I personally was to follow Jesus and wasn't able to. And I still have those longings to this day to go into the wilderness for days or weeks or months on end, or maybe years, and it hasn't happened, and I would love it to happen. But I just wanted to think about two things, what it means to enter the desert. The desert allows us to step outside the center of empire, the center of power, and see reality from a different perspective. I want to talk about these two things. And then the desert encourages spiritual disciplines that can sustain us. So the first one, just sort of stepping outside of power. Like how does this happen? And so the more I was just sort of sitting on it the last few months, just thinking the spirit of that, like we need to get out of the center of power to encounter the reality of the gospel, so that it's not just intertwined in our comfortable, powerful structures or whatever privileged areas we're living in, that it's just sort of becoming a mundane life. When we're inside of empire, it's so easy to remain unaware of people suffering outside of those centers of power. It's easy to sit back, partake of the benefits of the system, right, that work for me, whether it's religious, political, cultural, economic, social. It's easy to remain unaware of those suffering on the margins, just sit back and partake. But when we step out, we can build relationships with someone different, someone very extremely different. It could be across the world, it could be across the street, but it can change us in some ways the same way maybe that the desert changes us when we go out. We can listen to stories, we can pay attention to patterns as they emerge. When we're living incarnationally, and we hear stories over and over again, and they sound so similar, you're like, well, how can that be? That's not what I've heard, that's not what I've known my whole life. We start thinking, wait, this is a reality I wasn't aware of. We can put ourselves under authority of someone from a different cultural heritage. We can go live in a setting where we're the minority. We can study history and theology through the eyes of a different cultural group. I've found, sort of jumping back and forth between cultures, that the same historical events have very different narratives depending on who you're listening to. I find that certainly the case being right on the border. Some of the heroes of the kids in the neighborhood that I live in are like the villains in the Texas history books, and people can go at it like, what's the reality? Was the hero? Was she a hero or a villain? Theology too. So much of our theology, Protestant theology, is coming from the last 400 or 500 years. But if we go back to Egypt, there was 1,500 years of history and theology developed before that as part of our heritage. And we sort of started off in this European setting, and it's really a very Middle Eastern tradition, and the theologies run so deep there. And when we listen to our brothers and sisters all around the world, there's different parts of the reality of God that come forth in ways that we wouldn't have even imagined. We can see it from a new perspective. We can look from the outside in. Sometimes the misaligned priorities become a little clearer. Priorities that we've developed where we just become comfortable. When we're outside of it, when we're seeing it from a different perspective, they become pretty clear sometimes, like, wow, that's not really the way I should have been living. We may be forced to face some huge fears. Our privileges are revealed, and we're moved to contend for shalom because we realize, wow, the kingdom of God or the reign of God is not at hand by any means in my country, in my state, in my city. And what can I do? What does it mean to contend for shalom, for peace, for wholeness? In all of these areas. So the desert allows us to step outside the center of empire and see reality from a different perspective. That was the spirit in which the desert fathers and mothers moved into the desert. That was what they went there for, because they're like, we are not going to be able to really know how to live properly if we're so aligned with the power structures of our day that we can't distinguish between what's political, what's social, what's religious, and what's really our faith. So we need to go out to the desert. And I think in a sense, when we're working and when we're interacting in places that are on the margins, we get that similar experience. So that was the first one. The second one, just the desert encourages us, encourages spiritual disciplines for sustenance. And I've just been reading, I just finished reading a book by Henry Nouwen, and he's talking about basically lessons from the desert, from the spiritual fathers and mothers. And he talks about what happens when we go into the desert, in a spiritual sense, and he talks about silence, solitude, and prayer. And we're unable to connect. But what I wanted to focus on was the solitude. It really struck me as I was reading through the book. It's talking about solitude and the solitude that transforms us. It wasn't a solitude that's sort of a therapeutic, personal thing, solitude for myself. But it's a solitude that's a burning transformation. It transforms me from inside, and it moves me to solidarity, and it moves me to action for those who are hurting. And so it wasn't when the desert, when the monastic desert fathers and mothers moved to the desert, they were not trying to disengage completely from society. They thought that the thing that needed to happen the most was to engage, but they were like, we don't know how to engage. We don't know how to engage right now in the places that we are. So we need to figure out how to engage so we can come back and love our neighbors better and know how to love our neighbors. And so we're stripped down. He talks a lot about when we're out in the desert physically and we're alone and we're in solitude, that we're stripped down. Our fears are stripped down. All of our props are stripped down. Modern day, like our phone calls, everything that we use to distract ourselves from the fact that that I am not a good person. That's taken away from me. And I realize that all of the pains in the world and all of the different things going on. Let me just skip to. No, never mind. I don't know where I am. No, that's all right. That when I'm stripped down, then I know I'm connected to all of the sins, all of the evils, all of the negative things going on in life. I'm connected to them because I have that in myself. And it's only through, by God's grace, that they're taken from me. But then that releases me from being judgmental. So it's in solitude that compassionate solidarity grows. In solitude, we realize that nothing human is alien to us, that the roots of all conflict, war, injustice, cruelty, hatred, jealousy, and envy are deeply anchored in our own hearts. So this is a story. There's all these stories. Maybe some of you have these books. I've got 2 or 3 books of like quotes of like these stories from these monastic stories from the desert fathers and mothers. And so this is one. A brother committed a fault. A council was called to which Abba Moses was invited, but he refused to go to it. Then the priest sent someone to say to him, "Come, for everyone's waiting for you." So he got up and went. He took a leaking jug, filled it with water, and carried it with him. The others came out to meet him and said to him, "What is this, Father?" The old man said to them, "My sins run out behind me, and I do not see them. And today I'm coming to judge the error of another." When they heard that, they said no more to the brother, but forgave him. And there are so many stories like this, and some of them are really funny and bizarre. And I've really enjoyed reading some of the ones that I've read. But moving back to just sort of the fruit of solitude there, compassion's hard because it requires the inner disposition to go with others to the place where they're weak, vulnerable, lonely, and broken. But this is not our spontaneous response to suffering. What we desire most is to do away with suffering by fleeing from it or finding a cure for it. As busy, active, relevant ministers, we want to earn our bread by making a real contribution. This means first and foremost doing something to show that our presence makes a difference. And so we ignore our greatest gift, which is our ability to enter into solidarity with those who suffer. And I think that's really at the root when we talk about incarnational living. Or what were the three words that you said, that he said? Be a person, be a neighbor. Be a person, be a neighbor. Do what God tells you. Oftentimes, all we can do is enter into solidarity because we don't have the answers. And the answer isn't necessarily that everything's going to get better. And we wish it did, and we do what we can to try to make everything better, but it's not, we can't. As that prayer from Oscar Romero was very clear. It's incomplete. We're never going to get there. Not that we don't try. We're trying our whole lives. We're pretending for it, but we're not going to get there. So, this was one more quote from Now. And why do we children of the light so easily become conspirators with the darkness? And for me, I see that sometimes little things jump out at me when I'm in one country or another. And not having grown up in the U.S. and not knowing anything about the political landscape, or what's right-wing, or what's left-wing, or what's conservative, and what's liberal, I didn't really have anything to judge sort of a policy on besides what seemed right, that seemed to be what following Jesus would look like. And so I think, like when I think of right now the political landscape and some of the way, whatever side someone's coming from, the way people are talking and what you're defending, and a lot of it is just we want to defend something that keeps us in power, that keeps things good for us, that keeps the status quo, but others are not benefiting from that. And until we enter the desert, until we enter the margins, sometimes it's hard to see that. So just like thinking of the church in the U.S. as a modern day example of a church that is somewhat convoluted, mixed in with power structures, with empire, which we push for because we want to see those values in there, right? But then thinking also of the church in Egypt right now that is not at the top and is experiencing a lot of hardships right now. And this church, when I mentioned we was just in Egypt, and I was blown away by the attitude of the followers of Jesus in Egypt right now, in the middle of extreme uncertainty, a couple of revolutions. You probably, if you remember about a year ago, there was 21 Egyptian laborers who were beheaded publicly in Libya. Well, actually, that Father Thomas, who I showed a picture of earlier, that Coptic bishop, he was actually part of the team that was trying to negotiate to get them released, and had seen sort of what they were experiencing, or a hint of it, for a number of months. And he said he was blown away by the faith that these guys had. And those 21, through all this torture and through everything that was happening, they didn't give up. They didn't betray the name of Jesus. They stayed with it. And on their lips, as they're being beheaded, they were calling out to Jesus. And of course, so the head of, talking to another guy there, the head of the Bible Society, that puts out Christian material in Egypt, they were like, we got to publish something. We have to publish something. They're pulling all their staff together the day after this happened. And he said everybody was depressed, but there was this one lady who was just like, just excited. And he was like, how can you be excited? And she's like, for my whole life, I've heard stories from all these different centuries of martyrs, of Christians in Egypt who followed their faith and died for their faith because they believed in it so much. She's like, but it seems so far removed, like it wasn't related to my life. She's like, now I know it's still true, so I'm encouraged that we are still a people who die for our faith. And what ended up happening in Egypt over the coming months is that the president of Egypt went and visited the family of the villagers who were beheaded. It became really sort of a public media thing. And there was so many amazing chances for people of faith, for Christians, followers of Jesus, to be saying sort of what they believed. And they were expressing words of forgiveness to the perpetrators. And there was sort of a sense of, not everywhere, but a sense of healing that was coming from that. And people were attracted to that. They were attracted to the light and the beauty of that. And so the church in Egypt, to these forces of terrorism and fear and the unknown, this is sort of what the church in Egypt, under extreme pressure, how they're reacting. And then I flip over and I'm in the U.S., and I'm thinking about the rhetoric that's coming out of a lot of the churches who I love, people I love, and it's just like, in Egypt it's a message of love to the Muslims, the Christians, not everybody, but it was like, we need to love our Muslim neighbors. And over here, I'll come back and you hear it's not like everybody's saying this, but there are many church figures saying, shut them out, don't let Muslims in. And it's sort of like equating all Muslims as terrorists. And then I see that, and we're in a border community. El Paso's, over 80% Hispanic. Our neighborhood is, 99% Hispanic. And they're scared. They're scared, from what's being said from up top, but also what's being defended and said over again in our churches. How much time is there? 5 minutes. Bethany, do you want to share it? Can you share a little bit about? Bethany works with middle schoolers, and she's just sort of over the last few months been hearing stories and processing with them, just sort of some of what they're feeling. So I'll let her talk.
So it's just been interesting. I work with middle schoolers, after-school program, and just hearing their conversations around this. Middle schoolers and young kids will hear words being spoken and they'll interpret it a different way. So I've got kids that hear that Trump, for example, wants to build a wall, and they assume that means they're never going to see their family on the other side of that wall, or they have to choose what side they're on. I have kids joking, saying things like, what are you going to do if Trump gets elected? And this is where we are. I'm not trying to go political. This is where we're at right now. And I have kids joking that they're going to kill themselves. And they're joking, but that's not funny. I voted in the primaries. I had my sticker on. And I put my sticker on so my kids could see that I voted, like good citizen. And so many of them came up to me and said, who did you vote for? And it wasn't an excitement. It was a fear. It was like, who did you vote for? And I was like, I would just tell them not Trump. And they would sigh, like everything's okay. And I'm like, come on guys, really? But there's this fear that they have that some of them don't want to admit it or not. So I was actually in Chicago this past week, and I got to participate in the protest, and that was actually canceled. And a huge motivator for me to be there was my kids. And the fear that they experienced, and the fact that they were feeling at such a young age that they weren't wanted, that something was wrong with them, and that a bunch of people didn't like them. My kids know that Jesus loves them. I'll ask them, what do you think Jesus thinks about immigrants? What do you think Jesus thinks about families of incarcerated people? And they'll say, Jesus loves me, he's my papa, he's always there for me. And then I'll ask them, what do you think other people think of you? And they'll say, they don't like us, they don't want us, they think that I'm just like my brother who's in jail, or they just think I'm just like whatever it is that they hear. So they understand that Jesus loves them, but they absolutely are aware that there are people out there that don't like them. And so when I went to the protest, I remember just really kind of being afraid, because I'm Hispanic, I'm 7 months pregnant, and it's kind of a scary thing to be there. But I also felt like God encouraged me to go, because I think he wanted me to show them that we as Hispanic people, we're humans. We are just as much part of the human race as anybody else. And this stuff is ugly. And while I was in line at the protest, I just remember God just bringing to my mind my kids' faces, my students' faces. And I got to share, it was great. I actually got to share this with my kids just yesterday. And something really special was that they perked up and they said, did you see my face? Did you see my face? And I said, yeah, and God told me something about you. And they asked me, what did God say? And I said, God told me that he loves you very much, and that what hurts them hurts God, and that God hurts that they're afraid, and that's why I needed to be there. And their faces changed, and they smiled, and they focused. And middle schoolers, it's really hard to focus middle schoolers. But I just want to share that there's whatever is being spoken out by like people like Trump or whatever, or even people they hear outside, like it trickles down to our kids, and they're afraid, and their minds are being hardwired to feel like they're not loved or they're not wanted, and that's really ugly and scary. And so it's so important that we as Christians speak against that, and speak to their humanity, and speak to the love that they know that God has for them, but also the love that his people are supposed to have for them too. So.
I think when we step out of the halls of power and we become friends and build relationships and love a whole lot of people, then it's hard to, then we can't say certain words, we can't act a certain way because there are faces that are in front of us. So when I hear things said about Muslims too, it's really hard for me. I have, many friends that I think that's them. Or in my neighborhood, if I hear something about an immigrant, I'm like, are you kidding me? Or about Syrian refugees, or about whatever it is. And again, it's like we're called as followers of Jesus to speak the truth, wherever that is. It's not attached to some political party or not. But if a political party or a person inside of some structure like that is not speaking the truth and is not following what Jesus would follow, then that's our job, and that's our job to be following that and to make sure that we're not becoming conspirators with the darkness. I'll end there.